The liberation of Belgium in September 1944, following years of brutal Nazi occupation, was a moment of immense joy, but also one of vengeance and revenge. Amongst the most notorious post-liberation acts of retribution was the public humiliation, torture, and head-shaving of women accused of having maintained relationships with German soldiers during World War II. These women, derisively referred to as femmes tondeuses, or shorn women, became symbols of collaboration in the eyes of many Belgian patriots and resistance fighters. While some of these women were genuine collaborators, informants, spies, or mistresses of high-ranking Germans, many others were ordinary civilians who had formed relationships for survival, often under coercion. In Belgium, as in neighbouring France and the Netherlands, the shaving of women's heads became both a theatrical form of public justice and a deeply gendered punishment, revealing underlying tensions between war, morality, and nationalism. To support our channel, please click subscribe. Belgium was invaded by Nazi Germany in May 1940, and for 4 long years, the country endured occupation. German military and administrative authorities dominated public life, seizing resources, enforcing harsh laws, and deporting Jewish people and political dissidents. Resistance movements did emerge, ranging from underground networks that printed illegal newspapers to armed partisan groups, but they were fragmented and often brutally suppressed. Amidst this oppressive environment, collaboration took many forms. While some Belgians actively worked with the Nazis for political or economic gain, others were accused of more personal forms of collaboration. Women in particular were targeted for their perceived relationships with German soldiers, known in France and Belgium as horizontal collaboration. In reality, some of these relationships were consensual, but many were not. Women often faced coercion, hunger, and fear. A relationship with a German soldier could mean access to food, protection, and survival during a time of deprivation. After the liberation, however, this was lost. In the public imagination, these women were seen as betraying their nation and its suffering. Their punishment would become a symbol of post-war vengeance. When Allied forces, including British and American troops, liberated Belgium in September 1944, scenes of jubilation quickly gave way to episodes of violent retribution. Across cities and towns, mobs sought out suspected collaborators. Men accused of treachery were sometimes beaten, lynched, or executed without trial, while women were subjected to public humiliation. Head shaving became the iconic punishment for women accused of having slept with the enemy. The shaving of women's heads was not a uniquely Belgian phenomenon. It occurred all across occupied Europe. In France alone, historians estimate that 20,000 women were publicly shaved between 1944 and 1945. In Belgium, the numbers were lower but still significant, with hundreds of women subjected to this treatment in towns like Liège, Antwerp, Brussels, and Namur. These acts were often carried out by local resistance fighters or civilians who felt emboldened in the chaotic days following liberation, where formal legal systems had not yet been reasserted. The ritual head shaving was both theatrical but symbolic. Women were dragged into public squares, often beaten or stripped to their undergarments, and forced to endure the cutting or shaving of their hair while crowds jeered, spat, and hurled insults. Their shaved heads were a mark of shame, a visible sign that they had allegedly betrayed their country. In some cases, swastikas were painted on their foreheads, and they were paraded throughout the streets barefoot, sometimes with ropes around their necks, or they were even tarred and feathered. These events were often photographed or filmed by Allied soldiers and journalists, further cementing their notoriety. The images of women weeping or holding their shaved heads high amidst the angry crowd became iconic representations of post-war vengeance. The public humiliation was meant to strip these women not just of their hair, but of their dignity, femininity, and social standing. The punishment was gendered in its very nature. While men accused of collaboration were usually executed, imprisoned, or shot, women were subjected to a form of punishment that attacked their physical appearance or reputation. It reflected patriarchal notions of honour, where a woman's sexuality was tied to the honour of her family and nation. By sleeping with the enemy, these women were seen as having contaminated the purity of the nation itself. The accusation of having slept with German soldiers was not always accurate. Many women who had relationships with Germans were young and impoverished, with few means of survival. Some relationships were transactional. A German soldier might provide bread, soap, or clothing in exchange for companionship. In a society where food was scarce and rationing severe, this was often less about romance but more about survival. Others were victims of coercion and outright violence, yet were still labelled as collaborators. Historians have noted that the post-war liberation justice often ignored these complexities. A woman could simply be accused because she worked in a German officer's mess or served as a nurse or was just seen talking to soldiers. In some cases, personal grudges played a role. Accusations of horizontal collaboration were an easy way to settle old scores, especially in small towns where reputations were fragile. While head shaving was the most common form of humiliation, some women endured far worse. In Belgium, as in France and the Netherlands, women accused of collaboration were sometimes beaten, assaulted, or paraded naked throughout the streets before being shaved. In certain instances, makeshift trials were held by resistance groups, but often these were little more than show trials without due process. Photographic evidence from Brussels and Liège shows women being forced to kneel while their heads were shaved, surrounded by shouting crowds. In a few cases, women were executed or severely tortured, especially if they were believed to have informed on resistance members or directly aided the Gestapo. The atmosphere of vengeance meant that mob justice prevailed, and even innocent women could find themselves targeted if they were seen as too friendly with the occupying forces. The Belgian resistance, who had fought bravely against the Nazi occupation, played a complex role in these events. While some resistance fighters sought orderly legal trials for collaborators, others participated in acts of mob justice. After years of risking their lives, resistance members were often filled with anger and resentment towards anyone who benefited from German rule. Women who had fraternised with Germans became visible and easy targets, unlike men who had collaborated, whose treason was often hidden behind bureaucratic roles. As the Belgian government in exile returned to power, it attempted to impose order and conduct official purges of collaborators. Thousands of Belgians were arrested and tried for treason or aiding the enemy. However, by the time the formal legal system resumed, much of the initial violence and humiliation had already taken place. Head shaving was rarely part of official punishment. It was a spontaneous act of popular vengeance. Over time, the Belgian government sought to reintegrate many of the women into society, but the stigma remained. A shaved woman would often wear scarves or hats until her hair grew back, yet the shame could last for years. Some women were ostracised from their communities or disowned by their families, and the psychological scars were profound. The phenomenon of shaving women's heads as punishment was not confined to Belgium. In neighbouring France, this was particularly widespread, with high-profile cases photographed by the international press. In the Netherlands and even Norway, similar humiliation took place. In all cases, the act symbolised both punishment and purification. The removal of hair was likened to erasing the taint of the occupier. In Belgium, as elsewhere, the practice has been since criticised as deeply misogynistic. Men who collaborated often faced legal trials or death, but women's punishments were public and designed to strip them of their femininity. The double standard is obvious. German soldiers who seduced or coerced local women were rarely punished, while the women bore the brunt of the blame. The torture and shaving of women in Belgium at the end of World War II stands as a stark reminder of the complexities of wartime morality and post-war justice. These acts of humiliation, carried out in the name of patriotism, often punished the vulnerable, while allowing deeper questions of collaboration and survival to go unanswered. While liberation was celebrated as a moment of freedom, it also unleashed a wave of vengeance against those perceived as collaborators, particularly women. Their treatment underscores how wartime relationships, often formed under coercion, were judged harshly by a society eager to cleanse itself of the shame of occupation. Today, the images of shaved women remains haunting symbols of the price of survival in wartime. They remind us that justice, when fueled with anger and prejudice can easily descend into cruelty. In Belgium, as across Europe, the Liberation of 1944 was both a triumph and a tragedy for those caught on the wrong side of public opinion. The story of these women deserves to be remembered not as a footnote of shame, but as a warning of how vengeance can eclipse compassion in the aftermath of war. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.